Long before mercy was spoken of as a virtue, the world was ruled by weight. The weight of stone walls, the weight of iron law, the weight of silence after screams. This was an age without softness, an age where kingdoms were not guided by hope, but by endurance, where survival was not a right, but a daily negotiation with hunger, cold, and fear. The land was divided into realms of stone and smoke, stitched together by muddy roads and guarded by towers that rose like clenched fists against the sky. Winters lingered too long. Summers were brief and cruel. Crops failed as often as they grew, and when they failed, people disappeared quietly. The air smelled of damp earth, burning tallow, and old blood soaked into wood that had never been cleaned. Even the wind seemed to move slowly, as if it had learned caution. Castles dominated the landscape, not as symbols of beauty, but as instruments of control. Their walls were thick, uneven, and cold to the touch. Moss crept between stones like a slow disease. Gates groaned when opened, chains rattled, and every sound echoed longer than it should have. These were places designed not to welcome, but to intimidate. Beneath these castles lay another world, a hidden world, a world without windows. The torture chambers were not secret. Everyone knew they existed. They were spoken of in lowered voices, mentioned in prayers, and remembered in dreams. They were carved deep into the foundations of power, where light struggled to survive and time lost its meaning. Down there, stone sweated. Water dripped endlessly from ceilings into shallow grooves, worn smooth by centuries of neglect. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of rust and human breath. Torches burned low, not to illuminate, but to remind those inside that darkness could always be worse. Justice in this era was not measured in truth, but in obedience. Law was not meant to protect, but to preserve order. Guilt was often decided before trials began. Confessions were expected, not discovered. And pain was the most reliable language known to man. The people understood this. Children grew up learning where not to walk, what not to say, and when to lower their eyes. A careless word could travel far. A rumor could become a sentence. Silence, above all, was survival. Kings ruled from thrones carved of oak and iron, their crowns heavy with symbolism and fear. They spoke of order, divine right, and necessary cruelty. They believed, or pretended to believe, that suffering was a tool, that pain refined loyalty, that terror kept the world from collapsing into chaos. And beneath them worked the silent men, the jailers, the wardens, the executioners. They did not shout, they did not boast. They learned to move slowly, deliberately. Their hands were strong, their faces unreadable. To them, the chambers were not places of horror, but places of duty. Ropes were checked, chains were maintained, instruments were cleaned and returned to their hooks. Nothing was rushed. Time itself behaved differently below ground. Minutes stretched, hours dissolved. Prisoners lost track of days as hope thinned and breath slowed. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply listened to the dripping water and waited for footsteps on stone. Above, life continued. Markets opened, bells rang, bread was baked, people laughed, married, and buried their dead. The chambers below did not interrupt the rhythm of daily life. They supported it. This was a world where mercy was considered weakness, where compassion was dangerous, where pain was accepted as currency, and fear was the most stable form of governance ever invented. And it is here, in the cold foundations of these castles, that our chronicle truly begins. Not with heroes, not with hope, but with stone, silence, and the quiet understanding that once you descended into these chambers, the world above no longer mattered. The age that birthed the torture chambers did not begin with cruelty. It began with scarcity. The land was unforgiving. Rain fell when it was not needed, and vanished when crops begged for it. Fields cracked under summer heat, then froze into iron sheets during winters that swallowed entire villages. Hunger was a constant companion, thin as a shadow, and just as patient. People lived close to the ground, both physically and spiritually. Their homes were low, built of timber and mud, their roofs heavy with straw and soot. Smoke rarely left their clothes. Their hands were rough before childhood ended. Life was measured not in years, but in seasons survived. Above them rose the castles. They were not built quickly. Each stone was hauled, cut, and placed by hands that would never touch the throne those walls protected. Generations labored to raise keeps that outlived their builders, monuments to authority that did not require explanation. You could feel their purpose just by standing near them. They were not shelters. They were warnings. Inside the walls lived the ruling class. Lords and kings wrapped themselves in wool and fur, dined by firelight, and spoke of loyalty as though it were a natural resource. Their power was fragile, constantly threatened by famine, rebellion, and rival bloodlines. To rule meant to anticipate collapse. Fear became the solution. Laws multiplied. Decrees were nailed to gates. Punishments were announced publicly, not to correct behavior, but to demonstrate consequence. Justice was theater, carefully staged so that everyone understood their role. Obedience was rewarded with survival. Defiance was corrected beneath the stone. The chambers below castles were not an accident of architecture. They were planned alongside great halls and armories, as necessary as wells and kitchens. Power required visibility above ground and invisibility below it. Builders carved corridors deep into bedrock, away from warmth and daylight. They understood sound. Thick walls swallowed screams. Angled passages confused direction. Doors were designed to close with finality, not force. The people knew these places long before they ever saw them. Stories traveled faster than soldiers. A man taken at dawn, a woman who never returned, a confession whispered too easily to be true. Children learned fear the way they learned language, without instruction. Inside the castles, the men who served the chambers lived apart. Jailers slept near their work. Executioners ate after others had finished. Their presence unsettled even the guards. They carried the smell of iron and damp stone, a reminder that the law was not abstract. They were not monsters. They were craftsmen. Each tool had a name. Each method had a purpose. Pain was applied slowly, deliberately, as one might tighten a knot or sharpen a blade. The goal was not death, but submission. Death ended usefulness. Prisoners entered the chambers already defeated. The darkness did the first work. The cold finished the rest. Chains were heavy, not to restrain escape, but to remind the body of its limits. Above, kings justified everything. They spoke of order, of divine will, of the necessity of suffering to preserve the realm. They believed chaos was always waiting, just beyond the reach of fear. The chambers were the barrier between civilization and collapse. And so the system endured. Generations were born into it, lived within it, and died beneath it. The stones remembered them all. Blood seeped into cracks, dried, and vanished, leaving only faint discolorations that no one bothered to scrub away. This was the world as it was, cold, methodical, unapologetic. A world where mercy was not absent. It was simply irrelevant. Law did not arrive as parchment and ink. It arrived as memory. Before words were written, punishment was remembered. Villages recalled what happened to those who disobeyed. Names were spoken softly, then not at all. Fear traveled through families like inheritance, passed from parent to child without explanation. By the time laws were carved into wood or stone, obedience had already taken root. When kingdoms began to formalize rule, law became structure. Not fairness, structure. Councils gathered in cold halls where breath fogged the air. Lords debated borders, taxes, levies, and oaths. They spoke of justice as balance, but enforced it as weight. A heavy hand was easier to trust than a gentle one. Gentle hands invited questions. Judges were appointed not for wisdom, but for loyalty. Their task was not to seek truth, but to maintain order. Trials were brief. Evidence was flexible. Confession was preferred because it simplified the story. The chambers existed to complete that simplification. Above ground, courtrooms were arranged with intention. The accused stood below the judge, always looking upward. Guards flanked the space, armored and silent. Witnesses spoke quickly, eager to leave. Verdicts were announced in measured tones, often before the sun reached its peak. Below ground, time stretched. The transition from court to chamber was deliberate. Stairs spiraled downward, each step colder than the last. Torches thinned. Air grew dense. The walls changed texture, from dressed stone to rough-cut rock that scraped skin and clothing. This descent was part of the sentence. Prisoners felt the shift before they understood it. The body reacts faster than the mind. Breath shortens. Muscles tighten. The absence of sound becomes louder than any noise. Footsteps echo behind, then fade. The chambers were arranged like a map of intention. Holding cells near the entrance, interrogation rooms deeper within, the most severe instruments kept farthest from light, reserved for moments when resistance lingered too long. Nothing was random. The men who worked there kept records, not of pain, but of results. Which methods produced faster confessions? Which broke the will without breaking the body? Which left marks too visible for public release? Efficiency mattered. Pain was not applied in anger. Anger wasted energy. Pain was applied as procedure, guided by repetition and observation. Jailers learned to read bodies the way farmers read soil. A tremor meant fear. Silence meant endurance. Words came eventually, always. The law above depended on this predictability. Kings understood something essential. Fear had to be reliable. Inconsistent punishment bred rebellion. Too much mercy suggested weakness. Too much cruelty risked martyrdom. The chambers offered control without spectacle. Public executions were reserved for warnings. The chambers were for maintenance. Over time, the system refined itself. New laws created new crimes. New crimes justified deeper chambers. The architecture of castles evolved accordingly. Foundations thickened. Corridors multiplied. Drainage systems were improved, not for comfort, but to keep stone dry and usable. Even suffering required upkeep. The people adapted. They learned which accusations were dangerous, which neighbors to avoid, which words carried weight. Survival depended on awareness more than courage. Parents taught children obedience as protection, silence as shield. They did not explain why. Explanation invited curiosity. Curiosity invited ruin. In taverns and markets, rumors circulated. Someone had returned from the chambers changed. Someone had confessed to things they could not have done. Someone had vanished entirely. No one asked where the truth lay. Truth was irrelevant. Stability mattered more. And so law became ritual. Ritual became habit. Habit became destiny. The chambers did not symbolize cruelty to those who ruled. They symbolized certainty, a place where doubt could be removed, where resistance could be shaped into submission. In this world, order did not emerge from agreement. It emerged from stone, iron, and the quiet certainty that pain would always answer questions faster than mercy ever could. There was a moment in every kingdom when fear stopped being reaction and became policy. It happened quietly, not announced by decree, not celebrated in halls. It arrived when rulers realized that suffering did not need justification once it became familiar. When pain was no longer questioned, only expected. In earlier generations, punishment had been public and loud. Whippings in squares, executions at dawn. Crowds gathered, watched, then dispersed. But spectacle was unstable. It stirred emotion. Emotion led to sympathy. Sympathy led to unrest. The chambers solved this. Hidden beneath stone, they removed punishment from the public eye, while increasing its effectiveness. People no longer needed to see pain to fear it. Knowing it existed was enough. Imagination filled the gaps more efficiently than any executioner ever could. Pain became infrastructure. The law adapted to this new understanding. Crimes were redefined not by harm done, but by threat posed to authority. A word spoken too freely, a refusal to kneel, a prayer said to the wrong god. These were not acts of violence, but they were treated as seeds of chaos, and chaos was the enemy. The courts learned to move swiftly. Accusations were processed without delay. The accused rarely defended themselves. Defense implied innocence, and innocence required proof. Proof was a luxury reserved for the powerful. Once condemned, the descent began. The chambers were not places of sudden agony. They were environments designed to erode resistance before pain was ever applied. Cold floors leached warmth from bones. Darkness stretched hours into eternities. Hunger sharpened thoughts until they turned inward. Prisoners spoke to themselves at first. Then they stopped. Interrogations were structured conversations. Questions repeated slowly, patiently, until answers aligned with expectation. Silence was met with time, resistance with pressure. Pain entered only when necessary, and always in measured doses. The men who administered it knew restraint. A broken body was useless. A broken mind was valuable. They listened closely, to breath, to heartbeat, to the small sounds a person makes when hope thins. They waited for the moment when survival outweighed truth. That moment always came. Above ground, kings slept better knowing the chambers worked. Their rule felt solid, anchored deep into stone. Rebellions still occurred, but they were fewer. Whispers died quickly. Dissent became rare, not because people agreed, but because they understood the cost of disagreement. Fear was efficient. Entire professions emerged around it. Scribes who recorded confessions, architects who designed deeper cells, blacksmiths who forged tools meant not to kill, but to endure repeated use. Even religion adapted. Priests preached obedience as virtue, suffering as purification. They blessed the chambers without naming them, framing pain as divine correction rather than human choice. People accepted this narrative because resistance required energy they did not have. Life was already hard. Hunger, illness, and war claimed enough. The chambers were simply another fact, like winter or death. Children grew up hearing stories, not details, just outcomes. Someone spoke, someone vanished, someone returned changed. The lesson was clear. Pain was not chaos. Pain was order. The chambers became symbols not of cruelty, but of stability. They ensured continuity. They preserved hierarchy. They reminded everyone of their place. And in doing so, they reshaped the very idea of justice. Justice was no longer about right and wrong. It was about alignment and obedience. Those who aligned survived. Those who did not were corrected beneath the stone. This was the world at its most honest. A world that did not pretend to be kind. A world that valued control over compassion, certainty over mercy. And it endured for centuries, not because it was loved, but because it worked. The chambers did not function on their own. Stone and iron were inert, without hands to guide them. Those hands belonged to men who lived between worlds, not fully among the living above, not entirely buried below. They were known by many names: jailers, wardens, executioners, but among themselves they used none at all. They did not speak of their work unless required. Language weakened precision. Habit sustained it. Most were born into their roles, sons of men who had worked the chambers before them, apprentices who learned early how to stand without shifting weight, how to breathe without sound, how to look at another human being without seeing a reflection of themselves. Training was slow, observational. No instruction was given until it was necessary. A young warden learned first how to clean: stone floors, chains, hooks, buckets that never stayed empty for long. Only after months of silence was he allowed to watch. Watching was the real lesson. He learned how resistance moved through the body, how defiance tightened the jaw, how fear loosened it, how hope delayed pain, and despair invited it. He learned that suffering had rhythm, and that disrupting that rhythm caused mistakes. Mistakes were dangerous. A prisoner who died too soon raised questions. A body marked too clearly could not be returned to the surface for judgment. The chambers demanded balance, enough pain to compel obedience, not enough to provoke outrage. The men below understood this better than anyone. They were not cruel by nature. Cruelty implied pleasure. They found none. Their work was repetition, maintenance, attention. The same corridors, the same cells, the same routines. Day after day, year after year. Emotion dulled quickly in such an environment. Survival required it. Above ground, people avoided them. Their presence unsettled even soldiers. Children were pulled aside when they passed. Conversations paused. Eyes lowered. It was not hatred that followed them, but discomfort. A reminder of what lay beneath familiar streets. The men accepted this isolation. It was expected. Necessary. They lived simply, slept close to their work, ate when allowed. Their bodies carried the marks of labor: scarred hands, bent backs, shoulders shaped by lifting chains, and doors heavier than men. At night, when the chambers were quiet, some listened to the silence. Others could not bear it and kept small tasks going: sharpening, cleaning, counting inventory. Silence allowed memory to surface, and memory was dangerous. Most learned not to remember. They did not know the names of those who passed through. Names created connection. Prisoners were identified by charges, not identities. A thief, a heretic, a conspirator. Labels were easier to manage than stories. Occasionally someone resisted longer than expected. Not with strength, but with stillness. A refusal to speak. A refusal to plead. These moments unsettled even seasoned wardens, not because of fear, but because they disrupted expectation. Such prisoners were rare, and they never lasted. The chambers were designed to outlast resolve. Time itself was an instrument. Days without light, nights without sleep, hunger that sharpened thought until it turned inward and devoured itself. Eventually, everyone spoke. When confessions came, they were recorded carefully. Words mattered less than compliance. Once written, they became truth. History favored documentation over memory. The men below did not question this. Questioning implied choice. They had none. Their role was defined by the walls around them, the keys at their belts, and the routines that ordered their days. They were necessary. And because they were necessary, they were tolerated. In a world built on fear, someone had to carry its weight. They carried it silently, into the depths of stone, where screams faded quickly, and obedience was shaped one breath at a time. Not all who entered the chambers were enemies of the crown. Many had never intended defiance. Some were merchants who miscounted taxes. Some were soldiers who spoke too freely after drink. Some were widows who refused a lord's claim on land that had buried their husbands. The law did not distinguish between intent and inconvenience. It punished disruption, not morality. For those taken below, the first hours were the most disorienting. The body still remembered daylight. The mind still expected fairness. Hope lingered like warmth trapped beneath heavy clothing. That warmth never lasted. Cells were narrow, carved without symmetry. Stone pressed close on all sides. Floors slanted just enough to prevent rest. Water pooled in corners, cold and unmoving. Straw was replaced rarely, if at all. Light arrived briefly, carried by a torch during inspections. It revealed faces hollowed too quickly by hunger and uncertainty. Then it vanished again. Time unraveled. Without markers, days blurred. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams intruded into waking thought. Prisoners replayed conversations endlessly, searching for the moment everything turned against them. There was always such a moment, though it often seemed insignificant in hindsight. Interrogations followed patterns. At first, questions were polite, even gentle, a chance, offered sincerely, to explain. The tone suggested misunderstanding rather than accusation. Many believed this was their opportunity. It never was. As sessions repeated, patience thinned. The same questions returned, unchanged, until answers aligned with expectation. Contradictions were noted. Hesitation was interpreted as guilt. Pain, when introduced, was incremental, never rushed, never chaotic. The goal was not agony. It was erosion. A body can endure more than the mind expects. The chambers exploited this. Discomfort extended beyond tolerance. Pressure applied until thought narrowed. When the world reduced itself to sensation, obedience followed naturally. Some resisted longer than others. They clung to memory, to names, to faces, to moments of kindness that felt distant and unreal. These memories sustained them briefly, then betrayed them. Memory weakens under repetition. Eventually, survival instincts overcame loyalty, truth, and pride. Words emerged, shaped by suggestion. Confessions formed not from fact, but from necessity. Once spoken, they became fixed. Afterward, many were released. Release did not mean freedom. Those who returned above ground did so altered. Their gait changed. Their eyes avoided light. Conversations became brief. Silence followed them into rooms. Neighbors noticed, then learned not to ask. Communities adjusted quietly. A family missing a member reorganized itself. Children took on work earlier. Spouses remarried. Life continued because it had to. Those who did not return were not mourned publicly. Mourning drew attention. Attention invited questions. Questions invited the chambers. Grief was practiced in private, if at all. The chambers shaped not only individuals, but entire populations. People learned to anticipate punishment, to self-correct before authority intervened. Fear became internalized. The system no longer required constant enforcement. That was its greatest achievement. Kings praised stability. Lords praised obedience. The machinery of suffering faded into the background, unnoticed except by those caught within it. Generations passed under this arrangement. The chambers remained. Tools changed little. Methods refined slowly. The principle endured. Pain, applied patiently, maintained order more effectively than any army ever could. And so the world turned, season after season, stone upon stone, life upon life, each one shaped by the quiet certainty that beneath every throne lay a place where resistance dissolved and mercy held no meaning at all. No kingdom remains at peace for long. Fear may hold people still, but ambition keeps rulers restless. Wars arrived not as sudden storms, but as slow darkening skies. Disputes over borders, inheritance questioned, old alliances rotting quietly until they collapsed. When banners were finally raised, few were surprised. Armies marched across fields already exhausted by taxation and neglect. Soldiers wore iron that never quite fit and carried weapons older than themselves. They fought not for glory, but because refusal meant punishment. Desertion led downward into the chambers, faster than any enemy blade. Castles prepared for siege, gates were reinforced, supplies counted, wells inspected. Below ground, the chambers grew busier. War demanded certainty. Spies were dragged from taverns. Messengers intercepted. Farmers accused of aiding the wrong side. In times of conflict, suspicion expanded to fill every silence. The chambers answered it. Interrogations intensified, not in brutality, but in frequency. The same methods applied again and again, night after night. Confessions were harvested like grain, processed quickly, recorded, and used to justify further action. Above ground, blood spilled openly. Fields turned dark beneath trampling feet. Villages burned for strategic reasons that never reached those living in them. The dead were buried shallow, or not at all. Below ground, blood was quieter. The chambers absorbed the excesses of war. Prisoners taken during raids, captives who knew nothing of strategy but were punished anyway, officers accused by rivals, courtiers suspected of disloyalty. War sharpened cruelty, but did not change its nature. Pain remained controlled, purposeful, efficient. Sieges dragged on. Hunger pressed harder than swords. Inside castle walls, people learned the sound of empty stomachs. Bread was rationed, water guarded. Disease spread slowly, then all at once. In these moments, rulers relied more heavily than ever on fear. When desperation rose, so did the need to suppress dissent. The chambers worked without pause. Some prisoners were brought down directly from battlefields, still smelling of smoke and sweat. Their wounds were cleaned only enough to keep them alive. Pain layered upon pain until resistance collapsed entirely. Above, commanders spoke of sacrifice. Below, sacrifice was measured in breath. The war eventually ended, as wars always do, not with resolution, but exhaustion. Borders shifted slightly. Titles changed hands. Songs were written for victories that felt hollow. The chambers remained unchanged. Those who survived returned to their routines. Soldiers limped home. Fields were replanted. Children grew accustomed to new rulers whose laws differed little from the old. War altered the landscape, but fear maintained it. In the aftermath, rulers reflected on lessons learned. Armies were expensive. Loyalty was uncertain. But the chambers proved reliable once again. They had extracted information, suppressed unrest, and preserved authority, while chaos reigned above. This realization lingered. Power did not need love. Power needed endurance. And endurance was forged not on battlefields, but beneath stone, where screams faded and silence returned always, eventually. As kingdoms rebuilt, the chambers deepened. New corridors were carved, old tools reforged. The foundations of rule grew heavier, more entrenched. The people adapted, as they always had. They learned new boundaries, new dangers, new reasons to remain silent. And in doing so, they ensured that the next war, when it came, would find the chambers ready once more, waiting patiently, beneath the weight of history. As centuries passed, the chambers ceased to be merely places. They became ideas. Children who had never seen their doors still felt their presence. Travelers spoke of them across borders. Songs avoided mentioning them directly, yet circled their meaning with caution. Even rival kingdoms, enemies by banner and blood, shared an understanding that such places were necessary. Every age defines itself by what it hides. The chambers were hidden not because rulers were ashamed of them, but because visibility weakened their power. What was unseen could grow larger in the mind. Stone walls above ground showed authority. Stone walls below ground defined it. Castles expanded, and with them, the underground. New wings meant new cells. New courts meant deeper foundations. Over time, the distance between throne and chamber shortened, not physically, but symbolically. Kings did not need to descend to rule. They only needed to know the chambers existed. Their advisors spoke carefully, choosing words that aligned with fear rather than truth. Councils debated policy, but punishment was assumed. When uncertainty arose, the answer was never discussion. It was removal. Men and women disappeared into the foundations of power as naturally as water flowed into cracks. The chambers shaped culture. Art grew darker. Prayers became quieter. Humor thinned. Public life turned inward, cautious and measured. People learned to observe before speaking, to listen before acting. Trust eroded slowly. Neighbors shared walls but not thoughts. Friends avoided confidences. Families spoke in half-truths. Silence became the safest inheritance to pass down. Those who enforced the chambers aged within them. Their movements slowed, their eyes dulled. Some retired, if such a word applied. Others died where they worked, buried without ceremony. Replacements took their place seamlessly. The system did not require belief, only participation. A man did not need to agree with cruelty to administer it. He needed only to understand that refusal placed him on the other side of the door. And so the chambers persisted, not because they were questioned, but because they were never questioned loudly enough. Occasionally, a ruler attempted reform, a promise of mercy, a reduction in punishment. These moments were brief. Crime rose or appeared to. Rumors spread. Advisors warned of weakness. Fear returned, stronger than before. The chambers reopened fully. New prisoners filled old cells. Order was restored. The lesson repeated. Mercy was fragile. Fear was durable. As the world changed slowly above ground, the chambers changed little. Stone resisted time better than flesh. Tools aged gracefully. Methods refined but never vanished. They became symbols not only of cruelty, but of continuity. Proof that the world, no matter how turbulent, remained anchored to something solid and unyielding. For those who lived within this age, the chambers were as inevitable as death. One did not expect to visit them, but one prepared as though it were possible. Words were weighed, actions considered, loyalty displayed openly, even when absent internally. This constant calculation shaped minds. It narrowed imagination. It discouraged dreams that extended beyond survival. And that perhaps was their greatest function. Not the pain inflicted within their walls, but the restraint imposed far beyond them. A society shaped by fear does not rebel easily. It erodes slowly from within until collapse feels like relief rather than loss. The chambers waited for that collapse patiently, unchanged, knowing they would outlast kings, wars, and even memory itself. No system collapses suddenly. It weakens first. The kingdoms that had relied so completely on fear began to show signs of strain. Not rebellion, not uprising, but fatigue. The kind that settles into stone and bone alike. Fields yielded less. Roads crumbled. Armies marched more slowly. Messages arrived too late. The chambers continued to function, but their presence no longer inspired the same certainty. Fear, like any instrument, dulled with overuse. People still obeyed, but obedience had become mechanical, empty. They followed rules without belief, endured punishment without surprise. The emotional weight that once reinforced authority began to dissipate. This unsettled rulers more than resistance ever had. Kings grew older, heavier, surrounded by advisors who spoke in rehearsed assurances. They sensed decay, but could not name it. Every solution they knew led back to the same place beneath their feet. So they intensified what had always worked. More laws were written, more crimes defined, more people taken below. The chambers filled faster than before, but yielded less. Confessions became quicker, less detailed. Loyalty extracted under pressure proved shallow. The machinery of fear began to consume itself. Executioners noticed the change first. Prisoners endured longer, not because they were stronger, but because they were emptier. Pain still hurt, but it no longer carried meaning. Suffering without hope produced silence rather than submission. The wardens adapted as best they could. Procedures tightened, schedules increased. But efficiency could not replace belief. Above ground, life continued its slow unraveling. Markets shrank, crafts vanished, knowledge stagnated. Innovation was dangerous in a world where deviation invited scrutiny. The safest choice was always repetition. The castles themselves aged, stones cracked, foundations shifted. Moisture seeped deeper into the chambers. Walls wept constantly now, as if the structures themselves were exhausted. Repair crews worked alongside jailers. Fear required maintenance, even as it lost its grip. In distant regions, new ideas stirred. Rumors of different systems, of rulers who governed with contracts instead of terror, of courts where evidence mattered more than confession. These stories traveled slowly, distorted by distance and disbelief. But they traveled. Younger generations listened more closely than their elders, not with hope, but curiosity. The first crack in obedience often appears as a question left unspoken. The chambers still stood, still functioned, still claimed lives. But their symbolic weight had shifted. They no longer represented stability. They represented stagnation. When collapse finally arrived, it did not come as fire or invasion. It came as abandonment. Castles were left unmanned, guards deserted. Wardens unlocked doors and walked away. The chambers filled with silence deeper than any they had known. Stone endured. Iron rusted. Records decayed. What remained were empty corridors, tools without hands, and walls that had absorbed centuries of suffering without judgment or memory. The age did not end with justice. It ended with exhaustion. And in that quiet aftermath, the chambers lost their power, not because they were destroyed, but because no one believed in them anymore. When fear finally began to fail, it did not shatter. It thinned. The chambers still existed, their doors still closed with the same final sound. Chains still hung where they always had. The stone remained cold, indifferent, unchanged, but something essential had drained away, something that could not be reforged or repaired. Belief. For centuries, the chambers had drawn their power not from pain alone, but from certainty. The certainty that authority was absolute, that resistance was futile, that the world, however cruel, was fixed and unmovable. Now that certainty eroded. Prisoners descended the stairs no longer convinced that confession would save them, nor that silence would doom them. They entered empty, already resigned. Pain still worked on the body, but the mind no longer framed it as judgment or meaning. It was merely sensation, detached from order. This unsettled the men below more than any rebellion ever had. Wardens noticed it in the pauses, in the way prisoners stared without focus, in how screams shortened, not from weakness, but from indifference. Pain requires hope to function fully. Without it, suffering loses its leverage. The chambers had been designed to break resistance, not apathy. Records grew thinner. Confessions repeated themselves. Names blurred together. The meticulous documentation that once defined the system became ritual without purpose. Words were written because they had always been written. Above ground, rulers sensed the shift, but misread it. They mistook exhaustion for defiance, emptiness for conspiracy. In response, they doubled their reliance on the familiar. More arrests, more trials, more descents into stone. But fear no longer expanded to fill silence. Silence remained silence. The castles themselves reflected this decay. Great halls echoed emptier than before. Fires burned lower. Servants moved quietly, not out of respect, but resignation. The banners still hung, but their colors dulled beneath years of smoke and neglect. Kings spoke of legacy, of preserving order for generations yet unborn. But the generations listening no longer felt anchored to those promises. Survival had replaced loyalty as the primary virtue. The chambers, once symbols of inevitability, became reminders of an age that no longer understood itself. In their depths, the stone absorbed this change without reaction. Walls listened as they always had. Water continued to drip, slow and steady, into channels carved by time rather than intention. The chambers had never cared who ruled above them. They outlasted kings because they were never loyal to them. One by one, the systems that fed the chambers weakened. Taxes went unpaid. Guards left posts unattended. Keys changed hands carelessly. The rituals persisted, but the discipline behind them faded. Eventually, some doors remained closed simply because no one bothered to open them. The last prisoners waited longer than any before them. Not for interrogation, but for acknowledgement. When none came, they learned a new form of suffering. Irrelevance, power, stripped of belief, becomes weight without direction. And beneath the stone, where fear had once been sharpened into law, there remained only space, cold, quiet, and the slow realization that control, no matter how absolute it seems, always depends on something more fragile than iron. It depends on the mind. When the mind withdraws, even the deepest chambers become empty shells. echoing with memories that no longer command obedience. Long after the last keys stopped turning, the chambers remained. They did not collapse. They were not destroyed in fire or reclaimed by righteous hands. No final reckoning descended into their depths. The world above simply moved on, slowly and unevenly, leaving the stone to keep its own counsel. Dust gathered first. A fine, pale layer settled over chains, benches, hooks, and doors. It softened edges that had once been sharp with purpose. Moisture crept deeper into cracks, widening them imperceptibly. Moss found places to grow where torchlight had once burned constantly. The chambers began to forget. Without bodies, without voices, without the rhythm of suffering and routine, time behaved differently. Days meant nothing. Years passed unnoticed. Water continued to drip, not to mark hours, but simply because gravity demanded it. Above ground, new generations rose who knew the chambers only as rumor, as story, as cautionary tale told without detail. Parents spoke vaguely. Teachers avoided the subject. The past was acknowledged but not explored. Exploration required courage. Courage invited scrutiny. Some descended anyway. Scholars, drawn by curiosity rather than duty, crept into abandoned keeps. They carried lanterns instead of torches, notebooks instead of keys. They moved slowly, unsettled not by what they found, but by how intact it all remained. The tools were still there, not rusted beyond recognition, not broken, simply waiting, arranged with care that suggested continuity rather than chaos. The chambers had not been scenes of madness. They had been workplaces. This disturbed the scholars more than any imagined horror. They read old records, confessions written in steady hands, charges listed without explanation, names crossed out cleanly. The language was calm, precise, almost gentle. There was no hatred in the ink, no anger, no remorse, just procedure. The scholars struggled to reconcile this with their own understanding of justice. They searched for signs of excess, of cruelty driven by malice. Instead, they found order, systems, consistency. The chambers were not anomalies. They were logical outcomes. Above, society had changed. Law now relied on witness and proof. Authority answered, at least in part, to the governed. Pain was no longer accepted as argument. But standing beneath the stone, scholars realized something unsettling. The chambers had not required ignorance to exist. They had required agreement. At some point, everyone involved had decided this was acceptable, necessary, efficient. The transition had been gradual, invisible while it occurred. No single decree had created the system. No single ruler could be blamed. It had grown from fear, and fear had been abundant. The scholars left with more questions than answers. They sealed doors, not out of reverence, but discomfort. Some places were better left unexplored, not because they were dangerous, but because they were too familiar. The chambers faded again into silence. Centuries passed. The world above rebuilt itself on new foundations. Words replaced chains. Courts replaced chambers. Punishment still existed, but it wore different forms. Exile, imprisonment, shame. Suffering never vanished. It merely changed shape. The chambers, buried beneath newer stone and deeper memory, waited without intention. They did not demand return. They did not threaten. They simply existed as proof of what once was, and what could be again. Because the truth lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. The chambers were not born from cruelty alone. They were born from fear, scarcity, and the desire for certainty. Those conditions had not disappeared. They had only shifted, To understand why a modern person would not survive this world, one must first understand how deeply different the shape of the mind once was. The people of that age did not expect comfort. They did not assume fairness. They did not believe life owed them meaning. From childhood, existence was framed as endurance. Hunger, cold, loss, and obedience were not interruptions to life. They were life. Modern minds are built on expectation, expectation of explanation, expectation of choice, expectation that suffering should be questioned, justified, or corrected. None of these expectations could survive long beneath medieval stone. A person from the present day, lowered into those chambers, would not be defeated first by pain. Pain is universal. The body understands it quickly. What would break first is certainty. Certainty that someone will listen. Certainty that truth matters. Certainty that rules exist to protect rather than control. In the chambers, none of these beliefs held weight. There was no appeal, no higher authority that cared to intervene, no mechanism designed to correct injustice. The system was not malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as intended. Modern individuals are accustomed to visibility, to being seen, to being acknowledged. Even punishment today is framed as process, documented, observed, regulated. The chambers offered none of that. They offered isolation so complete that identity dissolved. Names meant nothing. Context meant nothing. Only compliance had value. A modern mind, trained to assert selfhood, would resist instinctively. That resistance would prolong suffering rather than prevent it. Silence, which once functioned as survival, now feels unbearable. The absence of explanation triggers panic rather than patience. The mind searches for narrative, for cause and effect, for fairness. None is provided. The medieval prisoner did not ask why. He asked how long. He did not demand justice. He hoped for release. His expectations were narrower, shaped by generations who understood that power was impersonal and mercy unreliable. The modern mind, by contrast, collapses when meaning is removed. Time without markers becomes torture. Darkness without reassurance becomes unbearable. Authority without accountability feels unreal, and the inability to challenge it fractures the sense of self. Even before pain is applied, the modern individual begins to unravel. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and uncertainty work more efficiently on those who have never learned to endure them. The medieval world trained resilience through necessity. The modern world rarely requires it. This is not a failing of strength, but of design. The chambers demanded adaptation or collapse. They rewarded those who could shrink their world to the size of the moment. Modern consciousness expands outward, searching for alternatives that do not exist in that environment. And so it breaks. Not dramatically, not heroically, but quietly, inwardly, as the assumptions that once structured reality fall away one by one. This is why the age endured for so long. Not because people were stronger, but because they were shaped to survive within it. Their expectations matched their circumstances. Ours do not. To step into that world is to lose the scaffolding that supports modern identity. Without it, the mind does not harden. It fragments. And beneath the stone, fragmentation was not corrected. It was completed. In the end, what remains of any age is not its power, but its residue. The medieval world did not vanish in fire or revelation. It receded slowly, like a tide that leaves behind unfamiliar shapes in the sand. The chambers were among those shapes, not erased, not redeemed, merely left behind as the world's attention drifted elsewhere. Stone remembers longer than flesh. Beneath ruined castles and rebuilt cities, the chambers endured as sealed cavities of memory. They were not marked. No warnings were carved. No plaques explained their purpose. Knowledge of them survived only in fragments, scattered through brittle manuscripts and half-remembered legends. Those who later uncovered them rarely stayed long. There was something unsettling about the stillness. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The sense that these places had not been aberrations, but conclusions. Logical outcomes of a world that valued order over mercy and certainty over compassion. The silence within the chambers was different from ordinary quiet. It felt layered, compressed, as though centuries of sound had been pressed into the stone and left there, waiting without urgency. Visitors described the same sensations: a tightening of breath, a reluctance to speak, a desire to leave without understanding why. The tools, when found, were often left untouched, not out of reverence, but discomfort. They suggested use rather than intent. They did not feel evil, they felt practical. And that was the most disturbing truth of all. The chambers were not monuments to madness. They were monuments to logic taken too far, to systems optimized without conscience, to societies that solved instability not by healing, but by containment. Above ground, humanity learned new languages of control: contracts, laws, institutions. The raw iron of the past was replaced with softer mechanisms. But the impulse remained. Fear did not disappear. It refined itself. The chambers taught a lesson that echoed quietly through time: that suffering can be organized, normalized, and justified when wrapped in necessity. That ordinary people, given structure and permission, will maintain systems that harm others without seeing themselves as cruel. This understanding lingered beneath progress like a shadow. Modern societies pride themselves on distance from such brutality, and in many ways that distance is real. Pain is regulated, punishment constrained, authority questioned. But the memory of the chambers reminds us that these safeguards are not permanent. They are choices, renewed constantly or lost. The medieval world did not believe it was cruel. It believed it was realistic. And realism, when stripped of empathy, becomes indistinguishable from brutality. The chambers stand as quiet witnesses to this truth. They do not accuse, they do not demand apology. They simply exist, holding the shape of a time when mercy was considered optional and fear was treated as wisdom. To stand within them is not to feel horror. It is to feel proximity. Proximity to a version of humanity that still exists, waiting beneath layers of comfort and assumption. A version that emerges when scarcity returns, when fear outweighs trust, when control feels safer than understanding. This is why the chambers endure in memory, even when sealed in stone. They are not relics of monsters. They are mirrors. Every age believes it is permanent. That belief is what allows it to function. The medieval world trusted stone, iron, and silence more than words. It believed that order, once enforced deeply enough, would sustain itself forever. The chambers were not designed with an end in mind. They were built as foundations, not chapters. And yet they ended, not with fire, not with justice, not with forgiveness. They ended the way all systems rooted in fear eventually do, by becoming unnecessary to those who no longer believed in them and unbearable to those who did. The final years of the chambers were not marked by screams, but by absence. Fewer prisoners, longer silences, doors unopened for weeks at a time. The stone remained cold, but its purpose faded. Above ground, people began to speak differently, carefully at first, then more openly, not because courage had suddenly increased, but because fear had lost clarity. It no longer pointed to a single place beneath the castle. It became abstract, uncertain, easier to ignore. Fear, when undefined, weakens. Kings issued decrees that echoed without response. Courts pronounced judgments that felt hollow. Authority remained, but conviction did not. The chambers, once the unseen heart of power, became relics of an older certainty. Eventually, no one was left who truly remembered why they had been built. The wardens were gone, the records incomplete. The logic that had once justified suffering had dissolved into fragments no longer persuasive. Stone does not argue. Iron does not explain. And without explanation, fear loses coherence. The world moved forward not because it learned to be kinder, but because it learned to be tired. Tired of rigidity, tired of silence, tired of systems that consumed more than they preserved. The chambers remained below, sealed not by morality, but by irrelevance. And that is perhaps the most unsettling ending of all. Not redemption, not reckoning, but forgetting. Forgetting allows repetition. The final lesson of the torture chambers is not about cruelty. It is about environment, about what people accept when survival feels uncertain and order feels fragile, about how easily suffering becomes normalized when framed as necessity. A modern person would not survive that world because survival there required surrender of expectation, of voice, of identity. It required shrinking the self until obedience felt safer than hope. We are not built for that anymore. But the conditions that created that world have not vanished. Scarcity, fear, uncertainty, the desire for simple answers enforced with force rather than understanding. Those conditions sleep lightly. The chambers remind us not of what humanity was, but of what it becomes when control replaces compassion and silence replaces responsibility. And so the story ends where it began, in stillness, in stone, in the quiet understanding that history does not warn. It waits, waiting for the moment when fear feels reasonable again and mercy feels optional. That is why you would not last a day in the medieval torture chambers. Not because you are weak, but because you are shaped by a world that has, for now, chosen differently. And when the lights go out and the stone grows cold, that difference is everything. Long after the last footsteps faded from the corridors, the stone continued to listen. Stone does not forget in the way people do. It does not choose what to remember. It holds everything equally. The weight of chains dragged across floors, the rhythm of measured steps, the pauses where breath once trembled and then steadied. These impressions did not vanish. They settled, layer upon layer, pressed into the cold foundations of places that would later be rebuilt, renamed, repurposed. Above those foundations, new halls rose, markets, homes, chapels, streets filled with voices that believed themselves distant from what lay below. Children played where corridors once ran. Fires warmed rooms that had been carved directly over cells, meant to drain warmth from the body. Life reclaimed the surface easily. It always does. But the deep places remained unchanged, sealed perhaps, forgotten often, yet present, waiting without intention, without hunger, without mercy. The medieval world did not pass its knowledge forward cleanly. It left fragments, practices disguised as tradition, reflexes mistaken for wisdom, the belief that order must be enforced, not earned, that fear is faster than trust, that silence is safer than dissent. These ideas survived because they were useful. They survived because, in moments of uncertainty, they felt familiar. The chambers were never about cruelty alone. They were about resolution, about ending questions quickly, about restoring certainty when the world felt unstable. They were answers to fear, not causes of it. And fear has never required much invitation. Even now, centuries removed, the logic remains easy to follow. When resources tighten, when threats feel invisible, when complexity overwhelms patience, the temptation returns, quiet and persuasive. Simplify, control, contain. The medieval chambers remind us that systems built to manage fear eventually depend on it. They require its constant renewal. They shape people into tools that maintain them, often without malice, often without reflection. That is why they endure in the imagination. Not as nightmares, but as warnings spoken too softly. To survive that world required more than strength. It required surrender, the ability to narrow one's humanity until it fit inside stone walls and unanswered commands, to accept that pain was language and silence was protection. Modern people are not trained for that kind of shrinking. We are trained to explain, to protest, to expect correction. Those instincts which feel like strengths would become liabilities beneath medieval stone. They would prolong suffering rather than prevent it. They would fracture the self instead of preserving it. This is not progress as superiority. It is difference as vulnerability. The chambers teach us that survival is always contextual, that what keeps one age alive may destroy another, that mercy once learned cannot be unlearned without consequence. And so the story closes not with condemnation, but with recognition. Recognition that history is not distant, that systems do not require monsters, that fear, when given structure, builds monuments that outlast intention. The stone still listens, not because it hopes, not because it threatens, but because it has learned that humanity returns to familiar answers when the night grows long and certainty feels scarce. Sleep now, knowing this not as horror, but as understanding. The past does not chase us. It waits. Fear rarely returns wearing the same armor. When the chambers were abandoned, fear did not retreat with them. It adapted. It learned restraint. It learned language. It learned to move without chains or stone. Where once it relied on darkness and iron, it now learned to inhabit systems, expectations, and habits of thought. The medieval world believed fear must be visible to be effective. Modern worlds learned otherwise. Yet the foundations remained similar. Scarcity still narrowed compassion. Uncertainty still invited authority. And authority, when unchallenged, still sought instruments that promised efficiency over empathy. The old chambers taught rulers that control works best when it is distant, when it does not need to announce itself, when people discipline themselves before power ever intervenes. This lesson endured. Long after the castles fell into ruin, societies learned to build cleaner versions of the same logic. Institutions replaced dungeons, records replaced chains, procedures replaced screams. Pain became abstracted, redistributed, disguised as necessity rather than punishment. It was no longer inflicted with tools. It was administered through outcomes, loss of livelihood, loss of belonging, loss of voice. The medieval chambers had been blunt. They relied on the body's limits. Modern systems refined the approach, targeting the mind and the future instead. The goal remained familiar: compliance without resistance. Those who lived in the old age would have recognized the pattern immediately. They would have understood that fear does not need stone to function. It needs predictability. It needs repetition. It needs people to believe that deviation will be corrected swiftly and impersonally. They would have known that the most effective punishment is the one that feels deserved. This is where the modern mind faces its greatest vulnerability. Accustomed to explanation and justification, it seeks logic in systems designed to be opaque. It expects accountability from structures that diffuse responsibility. It believes in fairness even when outcomes suggest otherwise. In the chambers, this belief would have been stripped away quickly. In modern systems, it erodes slowly, quietly, often unnoticed until exhaustion sets in. The medieval prisoner endured because he expected little. The modern individual collapses because expectation is high. This does not mean one age was stronger. It means each was shaped by its environment. The chambers demanded resilience through narrowing. Modern life demands resilience through expansion. When expansion fails, confusion follows. The old world broke bodies to preserve order. The new world breaks certainty. Both achieve similar results with different tools. The chambers stand in memory as reminders of this continuity, not as accusations, but as context. They show us that cruelty is not always loud, and mercy is not always obvious. They ask a quiet question that echoes across centuries. What do we accept when we are afraid? What do we justify when stability feels threatened? What systems do we maintain not because they are just, but because they feel familiar? These questions have no final answers. They shift with circumstance. They return whenever fear feels reasonable again. And that is why the chambers still matter. Not because they represent a barbaric past, but because they reveal a pattern that has never truly ended. A pattern that adapts, refines, and waits for moments of weakness to reassert itself. The stone listened once. Now history does. And whether we hear it clearly depends not on how far we believe we have come, but on how willing we are to recognize the echoes beneath our own foundations. There's a long silence that follows every age built on fear. Not peace, not relief, but a pause in which the world learns how to breathe differently. After the chambers fell silent, people did not suddenly become kinder. They became cautious in a new way. They learned to distrust absolutes, to question systems that promised certainty at the cost of dignity. But this learning was uneven, fragile, and often reversed when conditions darkened again. Survival had always been the true law of the world. Only its expression changed. In the medieval age, survival meant obedience. It meant knowing when to kneel, when to speak, and when to disappear into the background of history. Strength was measured not by defiance but by endurance. The strongest were those who learned how to make themselves small enough to pass unnoticed beneath power's gaze. The chambers enforced this lesson relentlessly. They trained people to anticipate punishment before it arrived, to internalize authority so completely that external force became almost unnecessary. A population shaped this way does not rebel loudly. It erodes quietly, adapting itself to the limits imposed upon it. Modern survival demands something else entirely. It demands visibility, adaptability, the ability to explain oneself, to assert identity, to navigate systems that promise fairness, while often delivering ambiguity. This creates a different kind of strain. Not the crushing weight of stone, but the slow exhaustion of constant self-justification. In this sense, the medieval world was brutal but honest. Its rules were clear. Break them, and the consequences followed swiftly and impersonally. The chambers did not pretend to be anything else. Modern systems often do. They speak the language of protection while enforcing compliance. They promise opportunity while narrowing pathways. They replace the physical descent into stone with administrative corridors that feel endless and impersonal. The effect on the mind is subtle but profound. Where the medieval prisoner learned to surrender expectation quickly, the modern individual resists longer, searching for logic, appeal, explanation. That resistance, once useful, becomes corrosive when answers do not arrive. Confusion replaces clarity. Anxiety replaces fear. The chambers crush the body to discipline the mind. Modern systems strain the mind until the body follows. Neither is humane. Both are effective in their own ways. This is why a modern person would not last long in the medieval chambers, not because the pain would be unbearable, but because the world view would collapse too quickly. The belief in dialogue, in fairness, in correction, would turn into liability. The medieval world did not negotiate with suffering. It normalized it. Those born into that age learned early that life was something to be endured rather than improved. Hope was dangerous if it exceeded circumstance. Dreams were private, unspoken, and often abandoned. We are shaped differently now. We are taught that systems can be changed, that voices matter, that suffering is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. These beliefs are powerful, but they are also fragile when placed in an environment that does not recognize them. In the chambers, such beliefs would dissolve quickly, leaving behind a self unprepared for silence without explanation. And yet, the lesson cuts both ways. The medieval age endured because people adapted themselves to brutality. The modern age survives because people refuse to do so completely. Progress, such as it is, depends on discomfort with suffering rather than accommodation to it. The chambers remind us of the cost of forgetting this. They show us a world that solved its problems efficiently, decisively, and without compassion. A world that maintained order at the expense of interior life. A world that lasted a long time, but left little worth inheriting. Survival alone is not enough. Stone can endure for centuries. Systems can persist for generations. But a world that survives only through fear eventually empties itself of meaning. The chambers stand as proof, not as warnings shouted across time, but as quiet evidence left for those willing to look closely. Evidence that endurance without empathy is not strength, but stagnation. And that the true measure of an age is not how long it lasts, but what it allows the human mind to become while it does. Stone can endure for centuries. Systems can persist for generations. But a world that survives only through fear eventually empties itself of meaning. The chambers stand as proof, not as warnings shouted across time, but as quiet evidence left for those willing to look closely. Evidence that endurance without empathy is not strength, but stagnation. And that the true measure of an age is not how long it lasts, but what it allows the human mind to become while it does. There comes a moment in every long history when endurance becomes indistinguishable from avoidance. After the chambers fell silent, society did not confront them directly. It learned instead to step around them, to build above them, to speak of them obliquely, if at all. This was not denial born of ignorance, but distance cultivated deliberately. Looking too closely invited discomfort. Discomfort invited reflection. Reflection invited responsibility. And responsibility was heavier than stone. The generations that followed inherited peace without understanding its cost. They walked streets paved over old corridors. They slept above sealed doors without knowing what had been closed beneath them. Their lives were shaped by choices made long before their birth, choices that had traded mercy for certainty and left consequences embedded deep in the foundations of the world. They benefited from the silence without acknowledging its origin. This is how history often survives, not through remembrance, but through convenience. People spoke of progress as though it were inevitable, as though the world naturally bent toward justice, given enough time. But progress was not a force of nature. It was a reaction, a recoil from something unbearable. The chambers had not taught kindness. They had exhausted cruelty. Above ground, new institutions arose that promised order without terror. Law wrapped itself in procedure. Authority cloaked itself in neutrality. Punishment became distant, regulated, sanitized. Pain was no longer meant to be seen, but it was still present. The medieval world had believed that fear must be felt to function. The modern world learned that fear could be implied, that uncertainty alone could discipline behavior, that people would limit themselves if the boundaries were unclear enough. This subtlety created a new illusion. That violence had been left behind. Yet the impulse that built the chambers had not vanished. It had merely learned restraint. It had learned patience. It no longer required iron or chains. It required compliance reinforced through consequence rather than confession. Those who had lived under medieval rule would have recognized this immediately. They would have seen in the new systems the same logic expressed more gently, the same prioritization of order, the same suspicion of deviation. Only the tools had changed. This is why the chambers remain relevant even when sealed. They show us that brutality is not an anomaly. It is a response, one that emerges when fear overwhelms imagination, when leaders seek solutions that end questions rather than answer them. The medieval chambers answered questions permanently. The modern world delays answers indefinitely. Both approaches silence dissent, one through pain, the other through exhaustion. The people of the old age did not believe in reform. They believed in stability. Their world was harsh, but it was consistent. A person knew what awaited them if they crossed certain lines. Modern individuals live with ambiguity instead. Lines move, rules change, consequences arrive unpredictably. This creates anxiety rather than fear, uncertainty rather than obedience. And anxiety, prolonged enough, produces the same compliance. This is the deeper continuity the chambers reveal. Not a longing for cruelty, but a longing for certainty. When the world feels unstable, people accept harsh solutions if they promise clarity. The medieval world chose stone and iron. Later ages choose systems that feel humane but function similarly. The chambers do not accuse us of being the same. They remind us that we are capable of becoming similar. And this is why the modern person would not survive a day beneath medieval stone. Not because they lack resilience, but because they carry expectations shaped by a different kind of control. Expectations that fracture when confronted with direct, unapologetic power. The medieval world did not pretend to be fair. It simply enforced itself. To encounter that honesty today would be destabilizing. It would strip away illusions that now serve as psychological shelter. It would expose the raw mechanics of authority without mediation. And once seen, those mechanics cannot be unseen. So the chambers remain buried, not only beneath castles, but beneath narratives of progress and distance. They are left undisturbed, not out of respect, but necessity, because to confront them fully is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between order and cruelty has never been fixed, that it shifts with fear, that it depends less on morality than on circumstance, and that every age, no matter how enlightened it believes itself to be, carries within it the potential to build its own chambers, shaped to its own fears, hidden beneath its own stones. Fear does not begin as terror. It begins as calculation. In the medieval world, fear was practical. It answered questions quickly. Who rules? Who obeys? Who disappears when order feels threatened? The chambers were not born from rage or madness, but from the desire to remove uncertainty from human behavior. Uncertainty is exhausting. Certainty, even brutal certainty, feels like relief. Kings and councils understood this instinctively. They did not need philosophers to explain it. They saw it in the way crowds calmed after punishment was announced, in the way dissent dissolved when consequences were made predictable, in the way people adjusted themselves to limits once those limits were enforced consistently. Fear became architecture. Walls were not only barriers, they were messages. Thick stone spoke of permanence. Narrow corridors suggested inevitability. Heavy doors communicated finality without a single word. The chambers were designed to teach lessons before pain ever began. This education was effective because it aligned with human instinct. When the future is unclear, people seek systems that remove choice. Choice carries risk. Obedience feels safer. The medieval world leaned into this instinct fully. Every structure reinforced it. From the hierarchy of the court to the design of the cell, everything communicated the same truth. Resistance costs more than submission. Once this truth was accepted, the chambers did not need to work constantly. Their existence alone shaped behavior. This is how fear becomes economical. The modern world often misunderstands this efficiency. It imagines cruelty as excess, as something irrational or emotional. But the chambers reveal cruelty as optimization. Pain used sparingly, deliberately, in service of order. That is what makes them unsettling. They were not chaotic. They were reasonable within their context, and this is why they endured. People adapted themselves to fear because fear offered structure. It replaced ambiguity with rules. It reduced the world to manageable terms. In a life already filled with hunger, disease, and loss, this reduction felt stabilizing. The price was interior. Curiosity shrank. Creativity narrowed. Empathy weakened. When survival depends on alignment, difference becomes danger. The safest person is the predictable one. Over generations, this reshaped humanity itself. Children learned not to ask certain questions. Adults learned to censor thought before speech. Communities learned to isolate those who attracted attention. Fear did not need to be enforced aggressively anymore. It had been internalized. This internalization is the true legacy of the chambers. Pain ended at the skin. Fear entered the mind and stayed. Modern individuals are not trained for this kind of internal compression. We are encouraged to expand, to explore, to question. These traits are celebrated because they are compatible with systems that tolerate uncertainty. But remove that tolerance, and these traits become liabilities. In the chambers, curiosity would not be corrected with explanation. It would be corrected with silence, with waiting, with the slow realization that questions have no audience. The modern mind, deprived of feedback, collapses inward. Anxiety replaces agency. Confusion replaces resolve. The self fragments under the weight of unanswered expectation. The medieval mind did not fracture because it did not expect coherence. It expected endurance. This difference is not moral. It is structural. One world shaped people to fit fear. The other shaped systems to accommodate people. Neither approach is permanent. When uncertainty rises, systems strain. When fear becomes widespread, patience thins. And when patience thins, the temptation to simplify returns. Simplification always has a cost. The chambers are reminders of what that cost looks like when paid in full. They show us the end point of a logic that prioritizes certainty above all else. A world where questions end quickly, where obedience is clarity, where mercy is inefficient. To survive there required surrender of expectation, not strength of body. It required shrinking one's world until fear felt manageable. Modern people, raised to expect dialogue and correction, would find that surrender intolerable, not because they are weaker, but because they are shaped by a different bargain. The medieval bargain was simple: obey and endure. The modern bargain is complex: participate and negotiate. Remove negotiation, and the modern bargain collapses. The chambers did not negotiate, they concluded. And that finality is what makes them lethal to minds shaped by openness. They close loops that modern consciousness requires to remain intact. This is the anatomy of fear. This is the price of certainty. And this is why the chambers, though silent, still matter. They show us not only what was done, but why it worked. And understanding why something worked is far more dangerous than condemning it. Because what works tends to return when fear feels necessary again. Every system leaves behind a lesson, whether it intends to or not. The chambers left theirs carved not in words, but in absence. They taught that fear, when organized, becomes indistinguishable from law. That pain, when administered without emotion, loses its shock and gains authority. That people will accept almost anything if it arrives consistently enough and promises stability in a world that feels fragile. This was the final lesson of the medieval chambers. Not that cruelty is powerful, but that predictability is. In that world, uncertainty was more frightening than suffering. Hunger could be anticipated. Cold could be endured. Even pain could be prepared for. What terrified people most was not knowing what would happen next. The chambers removed that terror by offering a clear outcome. Disobey, and you descend. Comply, and you remain above. This clarity shaped behavior more effectively than hope ever could. Modern minds recoil at this logic because they are shaped by a different promise. That ambiguity can be navigated, that systems can be corrected, that dialogue matters. These beliefs create resilience of a different kind, but they also depend on environments that tolerate delay and debate. The medieval world did not tolerate either. It required immediate resolution. It rewarded those who accepted limits quickly and punished those who resisted understanding them. Survival favored adaptability over principle. This is why the chambers were not hidden in shame. They were hidden in efficiency. Their purpose was not to convince, but to conclude. They ended conversations that threatened order, and they did so successfully for a very long time. The danger of studying them lies not in revulsion, but recognition. The realization that their logic is not alien. It is familiar. It appears whenever fear outweighs trust, whenever speed is valued over care, whenever control feels safer than complexity. The chambers were not inevitable. They were chosen. Chosen repeatedly, generation after generation, because they worked within the conditions of their time. Scarcity, threat, and instability made their cruelty seem reasonable, necessary even. Modern societies are not immune to these pressures. They experience them differently, but they experience them nonetheless. When fear rises, patience falls. When patience falls, the desire for decisive action grows. Decisive action often resembles the chambers more than we like to admit. Not in form, but in intent. The medieval world teaches us that systems built to manage fear eventually depend on fear to justify themselves. Once established, they resist change not because they are right, but because they are familiar. Familiarity is powerful. It dulls outrage. It transforms the unacceptable into the expected. The chambers did not survive centuries because people loved them. They survived because people adapted to them. Adaptation over time feels like consent. This is the quiet warning embedded in stone. That survival alone is not enough. That endurance without reflection leads to stagnation. That fear, left unexamined, builds monuments. And that once built, those monuments wait patiently for circumstances to make them relevant again. This is why you would not last a day in the medieval torture chambers. Not because you lack resilience, not because you fear pain, but because you carry assumptions forged in a world that believes suffering should be explained, limited, and justified. Those assumptions would collapse beneath a system that does not recognize them. The medieval chambers recognized only compliance. They were final answers to complex questions. They were certainty made physical. And certainty, when pursued without mercy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The stone still holds this lesson. It does not demand remembrance. It does not seek forgiveness. It simply remains beneath layers of progress and belief, reminding us that the line between order and brutality is thinner than comfort allows us to believe. When fear returns, as it always does, that line is the first to blur. And whether we cross it again depends not on history, but on what we choose to remember from it. There is a fragile moment in every civilization when mercy exists, not because it is enforced, but because it is remembered. Memory, however, fades faster than stone. Long after the chambers ceased to function, long after their logic was studied, condemned, and archived, the world above them began to treat mercy as default rather than decision. Compassion became assumption. Rights became expectations. Protection became entitlement. These changes were not wrong, they were necessary. But they carried a quiet risk. What is assumed is rarely defended. The medieval world did not misunderstand cruelty. It embraced it openly, believing it honest. The modern world risks misunderstanding mercy, believing it permanent. This belief creates comfort. Comfort dulls vigilance. And vigilance is the true guardian of humane systems. The chambers were built because people once believed mercy was dangerous. They feared it invited disorder. That leniency weakened authority. That compassion slowed decision-making when speed felt essential. These fears were not invented. They were responses to famine, invasion, disease, and collapse. Fear made cruelty feel practical. Modern societies experience different pressures, but pressure nonetheless. Economic instability, cultural fragmentation, invisible threats, rapid change. These forces do not announce themselves with banners or armies, but they strain trust just as effectively. When trust weakens, fear resurfaces. At first, fear asks for protection. Then it asks for efficiency. Finally, it asks for certainty. Each step feels reasonable, each step feels justified, and somewhere along that path, mercy begins to feel optional again. This is how the logic of the chambers returns. Not as dungeons, not as chains, not as iron tools, but as arguments, as policies, as systems designed to simplify complexity by removing the inconvenient. The medieval chambers removed people. Modern systems remove voices. Both aim to restore order. The danger lies not in intent, but in momentum. Systems designed to manage fear tend to expand. They demand maintenance. They justify themselves by pointing to the chaos they claim to prevent. The chambers were once defended as necessary. Their necessity became tradition. Their tradition became unquestioned. By the time doubt emerged, the system was too embedded to dismantle without collapse. This is the cost of forgetting why mercy was chosen. Mercy is slower than punishment. It is messier than fear. It requires patience, where cruelty demands obedience. The medieval world chose fear because it promised immediate results. The modern world chose mercy because it promised long-term stability. Both choices were rational within their contexts. But rationality is not permanence. To survive without repeating the past, societies must remember that mercy is not a natural state. It is a maintained one. It requires effort, restraint, and constant reinforcement. The chambers remind us what happens when that effort is abandoned. They show us a world that solved its problems decisively and lived with the consequences for centuries. A world that maintained order but sacrificed interior life. A world that endured but did not flourish. The final tragedy of the chambers is not the pain they caused, but the simplicity they offered. They were answers that required no further thought. Once accepted, they freed rulers and citizens alike from the burden of moral uncertainty. And moral uncertainty is exhausting. Modern people would not survive that world because we have learned to live with uncertainty rather than eliminate it. We rely on processes that acknowledge doubt. We expect revision. We believe systems can change. Those beliefs are incompatible with a world built on finality. In the chambers there was no revision, no appeal, no tomorrow that differed from today. To enter that world now would be to lose not only comfort, but identity. The self shaped by choice, voice, and negotiation would dissolve under the weight of unanswerable authority.
This is the lesson that stone still holds. Not that the past was cruel, but that cruelty becomes tempting when fear grows and memory fades. History does not repeat itself precisely. It rhymes. It adapts. It waits for moments when certainty feels more valuable than compassion. The chambers were one such rhyme. They remain beneath us not as threats, but as reminders of what humans build when they believe survival requires silence. And silence, once normalized, is difficult to unlearn.
There is a temptation, when looking back, to believe that distance alone protects us, that centuries act as insulation, that progress creates immunity, that we are separated from the medieval world by knowledge, by technology, by moral advancement. But distance is not protection. Understanding is. The people who lived above the chambers did not think of themselves as cruel. They believed themselves realistic. They believed they had stripped illusion from governance and replaced it with order. In their minds, they were not monsters standing over suffering. They were caretakers holding chaos at bay. They lived ordinary lives. They loved their children. They feared illness. They prayed for harvests and peace. They laughed when laughter was permitted. The chambers were not the center of their identity. They were background, infrastructure, a reassurance that someone, somewhere, was handling the dangers they preferred not to see. This is what makes the age unsettling, not the extremity of pain, but the normality surrounding it. Markets opened on schedule while screams faded below. Weddings were celebrated above cells where confessions were extracted. Faith was practiced sincerely in chapels built over rooms designed to erase resistance. The medieval world functioned precisely because it compartmentalized. Pain was isolated. Responsibility was diffused. Awareness was optional. Modern societies rely on similar mechanisms. We delegate. We abstract. We trust systems to manage what we do not wish to confront directly. The difference is not in instinct, but in expression. A modern person entering the medieval chambers would not fail because they are softer. They would fail because they carry too much context, too many expectations of coherence between belief and action. The medieval mind did not require coherence. It required alignment. Once aligned, life continued. The modern mind seeks justification. It seeks explanation. It seeks accountability that connects cause and effect in a way that preserves internal consistency. When that consistency is denied, distress follows quickly. In the chambers, consistency did not exist. Authority did not explain itself. Pain did not argue its case. The system did not care whether it was understood. This indifference would be more damaging than pain itself. Pain can be endured. Meaninglessness corrodes. The medieval prisoner endured because meaning was never promised. Survival itself was sufficient narrative. The modern individual, accustomed to frameworks that explain suffering, would find the absence of narrative destabilizing. This is the final distance between us and them. Not strength, not morality, but expectation. We expect the world to respond when we speak. They expected the world to respond only when commanded. That difference shapes resilience profoundly. The chambers did not ask who someone was. They asked whether they complied. Identity, belief, intent were irrelevant. Only outcome mattered. Modern identity is layered, interdependent, built on recognition. Strip away recognition, and the structure collapses inward. This is why the chambers feel incompatible with modern life, not because they are more brutal than what we know, but because they are more honest about power. They do not hide behind language of care or reform. They do not promise improvement. They offer only stability, maintained through force. To encounter such clarity today would feel obscene, and yet it once felt responsible. This realization is the final discomfort the chambers offer. They remind us that humanity does not move in straight lines, that progress is conditional, that mercy survives not because it is obvious, but because it is chosen repeatedly in the face of easier alternatives. The medieval world chose fear because fear simplified complexity. Modern societies choose complexity because fear's cost has been remembered. When that memory fades, the old logic waits. Not to be revived exactly, but to be reinterpreted.
The chambers are not warnings carved in stone. They are questions left unanswered. How much uncertainty are we willing to tolerate? How much discomfort will we endure to avoid cruelty? At what point does certainty become more attractive than compassion? The medieval world answered these questions decisively. We have answered them differently for now. And that difference is why you would not last a day beneath medieval stone. Not because the past was stronger, but because it demanded a form of psychological surrender that modern minds are no longer trained to give. That training, once lost, cannot be recovered quickly, and perhaps it should not be.
There is a burden the medieval world carried without naming it. A burden so constant that it ceased to feel heavy, simply present. It was the burden of inevitability. Life was not imagined as a path of possibility, but as a corridor, with walls already built. Birth determined station, station determined obligation, obligation determined survival. To push against these boundaries was not courageous. It was impractical. The chambers existed because they fit this worldview perfectly. They were not deviations from the order of things. They were confirmations of it. Proof that the world responded decisively to those who resisted its shape. The idea that life could be negotiated, that fate could be challenged, would have seemed naive at best, dangerous at worst. People learned to measure themselves against limits rather than dreams. The weight of this expectation shaped bodies and minds alike. Shoulders bent, not only from labor, but from acceptance. Voices softened not out of fear alone, but habit. Even hope, when it appeared, was cautious, narrow, and private. This weight was not carried consciously. It was inherited. Children absorbed it without instruction. They learned from watching, from noticing who spoke freely and who did not, from observing which questions ended conversations, from sensing the shift in a room when authority approached. The chambers were not lessons taught directly. They were lessons implied. Modern people no longer carry this weight in the same way. Our lives are structured around the possibility of change. Education promises mobility. Systems suggest revision. Identity is fluid rather than fixed. Even suffering is framed as something to be addressed, not endured indefinitely. This shift is profound. It creates resilience of a different kind, but it also removes a certain hardness. The ability to accept limits without explanation, the capacity to endure without expectation of correction. These were not virtues. They were adaptations, and adaptations once unnecessary fade. To enter the medieval world now would be to step into a structure that does not recognize modern resilience as strength. It would interpret it as resistance. Resistance would be met not with dialogue, but with correction. The chambers did not negotiate. They concluded. The modern person, trained to expect engagement, would misinterpret silence as temporary. They would believe that explanation would arrive if they endured long enough, that someone would listen, that the system would respond. In the chambers, endurance was not rewarded with understanding. It was rewarded with exhaustion. The medieval prisoner did not wait for recognition. He waited for release or death. His expectations were aligned with the environment. That alignment preserved him. The modern individual's expectations would clash violently with that environment. Each unanswered appeal would deepen disorientation. Each delayed response would erode coherence. The mind would fracture not because it is weaker, but because it is oriented toward a world that no longer exists. This is the weight we no longer carry. And it is a weight that cannot be taken up again without losing something essential. The chambers represent a form of psychological gravity that shaped humanity for centuries. A gravity that pulled people inward, narrowed ambition, and stabilized order at the cost of interior freedom. We live in a lighter world now, psychologically speaking, one that allows movement, expression, uncertainty. That lightness brings its own challenges. Anxiety replaces resignation. Confusion replaces obedience. But it also allows for growth. The medieval world endured by compressing humanity. The modern world survives by expanding it. To last a day in the chambers would require shrinking oneself deliberately, abandoning expectations, releasing the need for explanation, accepting pain as communication and silence as resolution. Modern minds are not trained for that descent. And perhaps that is the quiet victory of time.
Not that suffering has ended, but that we have become less willing to accept it as final. The chambers ask nothing of us now. They do not demand judgment or condemnation. They offer only perspective, a reminder of the weight once carried, a reminder of the cost of certainty, a reminder that endurance without dignity leaves little worth preserving. And so the stone remains, holding memory without voice, while above it, humanity moves forward, imperfectly, uncertainly, but with a refusal to return fully to the silence that once defined survival.
Every story built on fear believes it has an ending. History rarely agrees. The medieval torture chambers did not conclude with justice, nor were they erased by enlightenment. They simply lost their necessity in one form and awaited its return in another. Stone does not dream of revival. It waits without intention, without impatience. That is what makes it dangerous. The world that built the chambers believed it had reached the final answer to disorder. It believed that once fear was perfected, nothing more would be required. That stability, enforced deeply enough, would sustain itself indefinitely. What it did not understand was this: fear is not a foundation. It is a fuel, and fuel must be replenished. When fear could no longer be fed with belief, the chambers starved. They did not fall. They were simply abandoned by the logic that once animated them. Their silence was not a victory. It was a pause. Above them, humanity changed slowly, not through revelation but through exhaustion. The old methods asked too much of the soul. They demanded shrinking, silence, surrender. Over time, that cost became visible, even to those who benefited from the system. The world did not become kinder overnight. It became more careful. Careful with power. Careful with punishment. Careful with certainty. This care is fragile. It exists only as long as it is remembered. The final truth of the chambers is not that they were cruel, but that they were convincing. They persuaded generations that suffering could be managed, organized, justified. They offered answers that required no patience and no doubt. And answers without doubt are always tempting. This is why the chambers still matter. Not as artifacts of horror, but as evidence of how easily humanity trades complexity for control. How quickly mercy is questioned when fear feels urgent. How readily silence is mistaken for peace. To survive in that world required more than strength. It required a willingness to disappear inwardly, to accept that voice, explanation, and dignity were negotiable. Modern people are not prepared for that negotiation. We are shaped by systems that promise responsiveness. We expect appeal, process, correction. We believe suffering should be temporary, explainable, and limited. These beliefs are not guarantees. They are choices, renewed daily. Beneath medieval stone, those choices did not exist. The chambers did not respond to belief. They responded to compliance. This is why you would not last a day there. Not because the pain would be unbearable, but because the absence of meaning would be. You would wait for dialogue that never comes, for fairness that is not recognized, for acknowledgement that is not required. Your mind would search for exits that do not exist. The medieval mind did not search. It endured. And endurance without hope, without voice, without expectation, is a skill modern humanity has intentionally unlearned. That unlearning is not weakness. It is resistance. Resistance to a world that believed silence was safety and suffering was order. The chambers stand as quiet proof of what humanity once accepted in exchange for certainty. They remind us that survival alone is not success, and that stability purchased with fear leaves nothing worth inheriting. History does not warn us loudly. It leaves us rooms, cold rooms, silent rooms, rooms that show us not what monsters did, but what ordinary people allowed when fear felt reasonable. And when you understand that, truly understand it, sleep comes differently, not as escape, but as reflection. Because the chambers are not behind us in time, they are beneath us in memory, and whether they remain buried depends not on stone, but on what we choose to remember when fear returns, and certainty offers itself once again. That is where the story ends, not with a scream, not with judgment, but with silence, heavy and instructive. The same silence the stone has always kept.